The wind was unnaturally still that morning in Montecito. A light marine haze had settled over the million-dollar estates of the privileged and protected, yet something far darker lingered in the air over one particular property. The gates, once symbols of status and privacy, now felt like a prison's final threshold. Armed with a court-authorized warrant, unmarked black SUVs rolled slowly up the driveway of Meghan Markle's mansion, silent, somber, and swift. No sirens, no announcement, just a quiet intent, like something long-awaited had finally come due. The residents of the secluded neighborhood wouldn't know what was happening until much later, if at all. But inside that estate, nestled between freshly trimmed hedges and manicured stone pathways, something was about to be unearthed that no one, not even the most seasoned investigators, was prepared to find. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. To the outside world, Meghan Markle had reinvented herself. From Hollywood actress to Duchess of Sussex, from royal rebel to American philanthropist, she had played many roles, each seemingly more carefully curated than the last. But behind the scenes, rumors had always swirled. Whispers of secrets kept tightly sealed. Questions that never quite got answers. Why had there been no official documentation of her children's births? Why the heavy secrecy around the Montecito estate? Why did even royal staff avoid discussing her with anything more than a polite shrug? It all came to a head on a quiet Tuesday morning, when the garage door groaned open, not by her hand, but by the order of law enforcement agents with gloves, flashlights, and questions. What lay behind that door would challenge everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle. It wasn't a storage room filled with gardening tools or seasonal decorations. It wasn't a gym or a wine cellar. It was cold, industrial, deliberately maintained. 3 large, human-sized freezers lined the far wall, humming faintly in the silence. Locked, sealed, covered in thick condensation and a layer of dust. Each had been custom-installed, with reinforced lids and power lines separate from the house's main grid. Whoever had placed them there had wanted them hidden, operating independently and silently. Their presence raised instant alarms. Why would anyone have freezers of this scale, running off a separate generator, behind a secured garage door? And why had they never been listed in any property inspections? The lead officer signaled to his team. It was time to open them. But before we go further, we have to ask, how did we get here? What forces, people, and suspicions led to one of the most bizarre and disturbing royal-adjacent investigations in modern memory? The story begins not with a raid, but with a whisper. 2 months prior, an anonymous tip had been received by the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department. The caller refused to identify themselves, but insisted they were a former employee with urgent knowledge of criminal negligence and disturbing biohazard materials stored on the property. At first, the claim seemed outlandish. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, housing hazardous materials? Was this a prank? A stalker? A disgruntled former staffer looking for attention? But the caller knew things, details about the security system, the garage entry codes, the make and model of the generators used to power off-grid appliances. They named staff who hadn't appeared on any official employment records. They even described the inside of the garage with such eerie precision that it couldn't be ignored. The sheriff's department flagged the tip and passed it on to a multi-agency task force quietly monitoring high-profile individuals suspected of financial and ethical improprieties. Meghan's name had already been floating near the top of that list due to inconsistencies in her charitable filings, surrogacy speculation, and questions around her children's documentation. That's when the investigation began, quietly. Surveillance drones were launched. Thermal imagery of the house was collected at night. Odd temperature readings were observed in one specific area of the property, the garage. It stayed cold even in the middle of July heat waves. Weeks passed. A quiet case was being built. A warrant was eventually approved, authorized not just by local courts but, reportedly, with the knowledge of federal agencies. Something smelled wrong, figuratively and, soon, quite literally. And so the day arrived. Meghan was not home at the time. Prince Harry was reportedly staying in Los Angeles with friends. The estate staff, reduced significantly in recent months, had no warning. The door was forced. The garage opened. And there they stood. 3 industrial-grade deep freezers, the kind used not for food or scientific experiments, but for long-term preservation. The locks were cut. The first lid opened. Inside was a form, wrapped in thick, translucent plastic, frozen stiff. At first glance, it could have been a mannequin, but the human shape was too exact. Fingertips, ears, a nose slightly pressed against the lining of the wrap. The second freezer revealed a similar form, again, sealed, preserved, and unidentified. The third held the same. No documents, no tags, no identifying markers, just 3 bodies, wrapped, frozen, and hidden. Authorities immediately sealed the area. A forensic biohazard team was called in. The power to the garage was isolated and rerouted to prevent disturbance of the evidence. A hush order was given to all responding officers. And yet, somehow, word began to spread within hours. One officer allegedly messaged a family member who worked in the media. A neighbor caught sight of the unmarked cars, and recorded footage later leaked to international news outlets. The speculation exploded across platforms. What had Meghan Markle been hiding? And who, or what, were those figures frozen in her garage? Initial autopsy efforts were slowed by the condition of the bodies, but early reports suggested something even more disturbing. The bodies appeared to have been preserved for years, possibly dating back to Meghan's earliest days in the United Kingdom. That detail alone cracked open dozens of parallel theories. Could these have been body doubles used during her highly protected pregnancies? Surrogates silenced and stored? Victims of a deeper, darker web no one had dared explore? The public's imagination caught fire. Hashtag Freezergate began trending. Social media accounts began comparing baby photos, analyzing video footage frame by frame, trying to discern inconsistencies. Some pointed to subtle differences in Meghan's children from one event to another. Were they really the same child? Or had stand-ins been used? Others dove into her past, drawing eerie parallels between old acting roles and scenes eerily similar to what had now become reality. And yet, for all the chaos, one voice remained silent, Meghan's. No official statement, no denial, no lawyerly pushback. Just a deafening silence from the woman once known for controlling every aspect of her public image. What did that silence mean? That's the question we'll continue exploring throughout this expose. We will dig into the personal history, the forensic findings, the theories, the timelines, and the people closest to her who have remained in the shadows until now. Each chapter will peel back another layer of a story that has left even seasoned investigators at a loss for words. Because when that garage door opened, it didn't just let in sunlight and law enforcement. It cracked open a Pandora's box of royal secrets, scientific horrors, and human questions that cannot be answered with mere PR statements or social media posts. It laid bare the possibility that everything we thought we knew about Meghan Markle, the mother, the wife, the humanitarian, might just be one more role in a script written for the world, while the real truth remained on ice. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not tabloid speculation. This is a timeline supported by warrants, statements, and leaked forensic logs. The story is developing. But one thing is clear. The garage wasn't just a storage space. It was a secret vault, and what they found inside it will change everything. It didn't come with a bang. It wasn't a dramatic knock at a station door or a handwritten letter slipped under someone's windshield. It started with a voice, calm, slightly raspy, and burdened by fear. On the evening of April 3rd, at precisely 9:42 p.m., a call came into the non-emergency tip line of the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office. It wasn't the sort of call that usually makes it past the initial screening desk, but this one did. The caller refused to give their name. They claimed they were a former domestic staff member who had worked at Meghan Markle's Montecito property during late-night hours, specifically assigned to managing the estate's private garage. "I signed an NDA," the caller whispered, "but I can't live with what I saw. If something happens to me, I want this on record." The dispatcher tried to stabilize the situation, asking if this was a joke, a hoax, or part of the endless stream of anonymous anti-royal harassment calls that occasionally trickled into the system. But there was something about this call, something precise, vivid, and unervingly factual. The caller knew the garage's exact blueprint. They listed the brand and model of the 3 industrial freezers. They described the unique side entry gate accessible only by internal security code. They referenced specific changes to the property's backup generator system made in 2021, details that had never been publicized. And then they said it. The sentence that caused the operator to place the caller on hold and elevate the report up the chain. There are people in those freezers. 3 of them. They were already there when I started working, and I was told never to open them. I don't think they're alive. I don't even think they ever were. That was the moment the tone shifted from disbelief to concern. The sheriff's department quietly flagged the report, filed it under internal review, and contacted an external federal liaison within days. Still, even at that point, many dismissed it as too extreme. Meghan Markle, former actress, royal outcast, now philanthropist, harboring preserved bodies in her garage. It sounded like something from a B-list horror script. Yet the precision of the tip continued to nag at the investigators. The caller had mentioned the names of 2 other former employees, both off-record hires reportedly dismissed before completing their first month of work. The departments ran background checks on those names. One had been a personal assistant who disappeared from social media a year ago. The other had filed a private complaint against an unnamed celebrity employer for emotional duress and workplace hostility, then abruptly withdrew the case. By the end of that week, a special investigative team was quietly assembled, not to raid, not to accuse, but to observe. The mission was simple: verify the structural claims of the caller without alerting the public or the residents of the estate. What followed was a series of covert aerial sweeps. Using drone thermal imagery and passive frequency monitoring, the team discovered something unusual. Despite record-breaking California heat in May and June, the garage's thermal signature remained cold. Not just moderately cool, unnaturally cold. Cold enough to suggest industrial-grade refrigeration equipment was constantly running inside. This confirmed part of the tip. The estate's electric usage patterns were also reviewed. While the house had solar panels and advanced energy-saving systems, one section of the estate drew an unusual, steady power drain during the night. Always the same level, always tied to an isolated circuit. This, too, matched the tip. There was still no physical proof of wrongdoing, but the concern had grown enough to escalate. The FBI, now included due to cross-state business and charity interests involving the Sussexes, requested sealed subpoenas for property maintenance records, blueprints, and security system data. They also conducted limited interviews with former estate staff under full confidentiality agreements. And then came the second twist. Another anonymous message. Not a phone call this time, but a package. It arrived at the sheriff's department without a return address. Inside was a flash drive and a printed image, grainy, time-stamped, and seemingly taken from a hidden security camera angle. The image depicted a freezer being delivered to Meghan Markle's garage. 2 men in unmarked overalls rolled the box in undercover of darkness. The timestamp? June 2020. The flash drive contained 4 similar clips, all dated months apart, showing the arrival of each freezer. The footage was low quality, likely compressed, but real enough to merit emergency escalation. The question now wasn't whether there were freezers inside. The evidence was mounting. The question was, what was in them? And why had Meghan Markle gone to such extreme lengths to keep them hidden? At this stage, law enforcement was working against the clock. If the freezers contained biohazard material, human remains, or even illicit biological agents, time was critical. Yet storming the estate of a globally recognized royal figure, even one who had stepped back from royal duties, came with layers of political and legal complexity. Authorities drafted a confidential application for a search warrant, citing potential human preservation violations, suspicion of unreported deaths, and concealment of biological evidence. The court granted it, under extreme privacy measures. This wasn't going to be a televised raid. There would be no media circus, no flashing lights, no noise. It would be clean, surgical, and completely off the books. But during these final preparations, something odd happened. Someone from within Meghan's inner circle appeared to make contact. A direct letter was hand-delivered to the sheriff's office. No return address, but it contained a signed affidavit from an unnamed security staffer who had resigned weeks earlier. In the document, they described unexplainable activities involving refrigerated units and a policy of strict silence enforced by signed NDAs. The letter alleged that during a routine inspection of the garage's circuit board, the individuals saw a body-shaped object inside one of the containers. They were told by their superior to never mention it again or face legal consequences. That staff member fled the job shortly after, fearing retaliation. All of this pointed to one undeniable conclusion. This was no longer a theory. There was too much data, too much corroboration, and too many frightened people breaking their silence. And then came the tipping point. Authorities uncovered shipping records tracing one of the freezers to a supplier based in Nevada known for providing long-term biological preservation chambers to private medical research groups. These machines were never intended for consumer use and had to be signed off with federal licensing for delivery. The signature on the order? A third-party LLC connected to a shell company, later revealed to be linked to Archewell, Meghan and Harry's charitable foundation. The legal cover-up had started to unravel. That's when the date for the operation was set. July 15, 2025. At 6 a.m., the team would move in. The warrant allowed access only to the garage and adjoining storage areas. Any further search would require escalation. But by then, they suspected they wouldn't need to look much further. What they would find inside wasn't just disturbing, it was unprecedented. In the days that followed the tip, the public still had no clue. The media remained quiet. The house remained still. Meghan was seen at charity events, photographed smiling, hosting small gatherings in the garden, never once betraying the storm that was silently building behind those garage doors. To outsiders, it was life as usual. But for those on the inside, the stage had been set. The truth had begun to leak. And once that first freezer lid was lifted, the world would never look at Meghan Markle or her carefully crafted legacy the same way again. Because no matter how well you conceal the truth behind steel and silence, one anonymous voice, shaking, scared, and seeking redemption, can crack open the facade. And in this case, that voice may have just unearthed one of the most chilling scandals to ever brush the royal name. There is a process in law enforcement that is rarely discussed in public. A process that doesn't make headlines, doesn't produce press conferences, and doesn't involve flashing lights or battering rams. It's the process of silent pursuit. When the stakes are too high, the suspect too influential, and the fallout too potentially devastating. What happened in the days leading up to the unsealing of Meghan Markle's garage wasn't a typical criminal operation. It was a calculated, delicate maneuver constructed under a level of secrecy normally reserved for national security threats. Getting a warrant to search any private property in California is no small feat. There are checks, balances, affidavits, and judicial scrutiny. But when the property in question belongs to one of the most famous women in the world, former duchess, celebrity, philanthropist, and American royalty, the layers of complexity multiply tenfold. The application can't be sloppy. It can't be rushed. And above all, it can't leak. For law enforcement and federal authorities working behind the scenes, the biggest challenge wasn't convincing a judge of probable cause. It was ensuring absolute silence. The walls of power have a way of echoing back warnings. Tip off the wrong person, and the subject of interest disappears, relocates, wipes the evidence, or files a lawsuit claiming unlawful targeting. In Meghan's case, all those outcomes were very real possibilities. The application for the warrant had to be airtight. To do that, the investigating team compiled an extensive packet of classified material. Drone footage capturing the garage's abnormal thermal readings, utility logs showing steady high power draw to isolated circuits, anonymous staff testimonies referencing body-shaped objects, and, perhaps most damning, footage of freezers being delivered under cover of darkness. Every component, when laid side by side, told a chilling story. It wasn't just speculation. It wasn't tabloid fodder. It was structured, corroborated intelligence. The official request was submitted under seal to the Superior Court of California in Santa Barbara County, under a rarely used provision reserved for high-profile, high-risk property searches where early disclosure could endanger the outcome. Only 2 judges in the jurisdiction were cleared to receive it. The one who did had a background in constitutional law and prior experience overseeing operations involving celebrities. He understood exactly what was at stake. The affidavit attached to the warrant application was over 80 pages long. It chronicled every call, every image, every recorded anomaly. It included the anonymous employee's written statement, along with supplemental documents suggesting that medical licensing laws may have been violated. It hinted, in carefully measured language, that the freezers could contain human biological material or remains not properly registered with any state or federal health department. But there was a dilemma. This wasn't just about property law or biohazards. This was about optics. How do you raid Meghan Markle's home? The very woman who had accused the British monarchy of racism, sexism, and abuse, and not turn it into a political firestorm. How do you avoid accusations of government harassment, character assassination, or racial targeting? For the Department of Justice attorneys reviewing the warrant in parallel, the answer was simple. Let the evidence speak for itself. Build the case so thoroughly that no one, not even her most loyal defenders, could ignore what it pointed to. To further insulate the operation from political interference, the agencies involved agreed on a multi-layered command structure. The physical search would be executed by a special division of the Sheriff's Department, while oversight and evidence collection would be managed by a joint task force including representatives from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the Department of Health and Human Services, and a forensic anthropologist from the CDC. The presence of health officials was strategic. It gave the operation a public safety context, which could be invoked if word leaked before the warrant was executed. The final draft of the warrant included explicit boundaries. It granted access only to the garage and any power conduits directly feeding into it. Officers could not enter the main house. They could not search the bedrooms, offices, or even the kitchen without obtaining an extension. This limitation wasn't a mistake. It was a safeguard, a way of showing the court that they weren't fishing. They knew where to look, and they had reason to look there. Still, the nerves ran high. There was a growing sense among those involved that they were walking a political tightrope. Too soft, and the evidence could disappear. Too aggressive, and they'd be accused of staging a public takedown. What none of them knew yet was how quickly the operation would spiral once that garage door rolled open. The date selected for the execution was chosen carefully, July 15, 2025. It was a weekday, early morning, during the peak of Meghan's known travel window. She had reportedly accepted an invitation to a women's empowerment brunch in downtown Los Angeles that week. Security monitors indicated that the house had been quiet for 3 days. Prince Harry had not returned from the city. Only one staff member, a groundskeeper, was listed as present on site. The command vehicle rolled out at 5:32 a.m. By 5:59 a.m., all access roads to the estate were under silent surveillance. There were no sirens, no warnings. Just a black van, a plain car, and a single box truck containing forensic gear pulling up to the gated entrance. And here's where the story takes a sharp, unexpected turn. The estate's main gate was supposed to be sealed, requiring either a resident key code or physical override. But when the officers arrived, they found the gate ajar. Not wide open, but not locked either. As if someone, perhaps expecting a delivery or trying to make a quiet exit, had left it unlatched. That discovery sparked a flurry of speculation among the team. Was someone expecting them? Had another insider tipped Meghan off? Or was it a fluke, a forgotten lock in the rush of a quiet departure? There wasn't time to debate. The lead officer gave the go. The team moved in, scanned the premises, and proceeded to the garage structure at the far end of the estate. The structure matched everything in the warrant: its location, temperature, reinforced security. The garage door was shut, but not sealed. A padlock had been placed externally, heavy-duty, newly installed. Using bolt cutters and documented protocol, the officers removed the lock, lifted the garage door, and stood face-to-face with the scene they'd been preparing for. The temperature hit them first. Despite it being July, the air inside the garage was freezing. Not chilly, freezing. Condensation fogged out from the open door like breath from a living thing. Inside, 3 massive white units stood shoulder to shoulder against the far wall. No labels, no logos, just faint humming and the low metallic rattle of compressors doing their work. One officer said later in a confidential briefing that the air smelled of antiseptic, rubber, and something else, something faintly sweet and off, like decaying citrus or spoiled milk masked by bleach. The units were covered in frost along their seals. All were plugged into a secondary circuit mounted above them. That circuit had its own backup battery system. Whoever set this up had gone to great lengths to ensure these machines never lost power, not even during a blackout. Photos were taken. Electrical readings were logged. Then, at 6:29 a.m., With cameras rolling and all teams in position, the first freezer was opened. The contents would be described in the official report as a sealed human form, wrapped in plastic polymer, head to toe, encased in a gel preservation lining, and exhibiting no sign of decomposition due to sub-zero containment. It was not a mannequin. It was not a training dummy. It was a body, unidentified, undocumented, and disturbingly real. The team paused, not because they were surprised, but because the implications had now moved from theory into reality. This was no longer about violating electrical codes or shady tax filings. This was something else entirely. The second and third units were opened in sequence. Each contained a similar form, wrapped identically, stored with the same attention to containment. All had slightly different builds. None had any form of documentation, identification, or digital tags. That was the moment the officer in charge stepped back and called for federal escalation. No further rooms were entered. No evidence was touched. But within 2 hours, forensic biohazard teams were on site, collecting samples, running preliminary tests, and preparing the forms for transfer to an undisclosed location. Word began to travel up the chain, quietly, cautiously. And yet, despite the silence, something began to ripple outward. A neighbor spotted the vans. A security employee made a call, and before the sun had set, whispers had turned into murmurs, and murmurs into questions. Why had law enforcement raided the Sussex estate? Why had the garage been sealed off for 12 hours? And why, according to one unverified photo leak, had 3 body bags been loaded into a refrigerated truck? The story hadn't broken yet, but the warrant. The carefully crafted, narrowly executed document meant to protect everyone involved had already done its job. It had opened the door, literally, and what it revealed would send shockwaves around the globe. The garage was nothing like the rest of the estate. Unlike the sun-drenched courtyards and magazine-perfect interiors of Meghan Markle's Montecito mansion, the garage had been deliberately built as a world apart. No ornate detailing, no decorative embellishments, no inviting warmth. Just stark concrete walls, industrial-grade paneling, and a clinical silence that even the most seasoned officers found unsettling. From the moment the door was lifted, it was clear this was not a place for vehicles or storage. The floor was spotless, lined with a special type of anti-slip epoxy resin, common in surgical theaters and cryogenic labs. The air, even through gloves and layers, bit at the skin. There was a low hum from overhead vents, subtly vibrating through the cement like the breath of something artificial. Every sound was magnified in that space. Every movement echoed. The 3 freezers stood at the far end, pressed flush against the rear wall. They weren't ordinary chest freezers one might find in a commercial kitchen. These were tall, narrow, and sealed tight with custom compression locks, each one reinforced with a biometric keypad and backup manual latch. The units stood just over 6 feet tall and roughly 3 feet wide, each mounted on vibration-absorbing shock pads. The power cords didn't run to the nearest outlet, but instead tunneled directly into a separate junction box mounted to the ceiling. That box, investigators would later learn, was tied to a generator hidden beneath a landscape tool shed 20 feet behind the house. Each freezer bore a small serial number etched into the metal near the base, but no visible manufacturer logo or model name. The numbers themselves didn't correspond with any publicly registered appliance records, adding to the growing sense that these were custom-ordered or heavily modified. The officers stood still for nearly a full minute before anyone moved. The air was heavy, not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that what they were about to uncover wasn't supposed to be found. These machines weren't placed here for convenience or necessity. They were hidden, designed to be ignored, buried under silence. The lead officer called for the forensics team to move in. Plastic mats were unrolled across the floor, creating a contamination buffer. Every movement was logged. Every fingerprint or traceable fiber would be preserved. Then came the moment they'd prepared for, but still weren't truly ready to face. The first freezer's outer latch was disengaged. A short hiss escaped as the vacuum seal released. A low wave of frost rolled outward, mixing with the ambient air and briefly obscuring the contents. The temperature inside was recorded at -27°C, cold enough to prevent decomposition indefinitely. What emerged through the swirling fog was a shape unmistakably human. Wrapped head to toe in translucent polymer plastic, the figure stood upright within the chamber, suspended by a full-body harness. The limbs were carefully bent at the elbows and knees to fit the contours of the space. There were no clothing identifiers, no jewelry, no personal effects, just a series of tight polymer seams wound tightly like a cocoon. Underneath, through the frost and the wrapping, pale skin and faint features were visible. A nose, closed eyelids, hair, blonde or light brown, frozen in clumped strands. The forensics team didn't speak. They simply worked, measuring, photographing, scanning. The height of the individual was estimated to be approximately 5'8". No apparent wounds. No visible decay. It was a body, yes, but not a rotting one. It had been preserved, maintained, and, in some inexplicable way, honored. Then came Freezer 2. This one opened more easily. The seal cracked under the technician's hand, and the internal lights clicked on automatically. Same polymer wrapping, same harness, but the figure inside this unit was shorter, slightly more slender. A woman, perhaps, or a young adult. It was hard to tell. The facial structure, barely visible through the frost and layers, had higher cheekbones and a more rounded jaw. There was no discoloration, no bruising, no trauma apparent. Just frozen stillness, timeless, clinical, haunting. Freezer 3 revealed the most shocking figure of all. This body had been placed differently, slightly reclined, with the head tilted back and the eyes partially open. The gaze, frozen and unblinking, seemed to stare directly at the team. A thin trail of condensation clung to the plastic where the mouth had rested against the inner wall. The limbs were crossed at the chest. And unlike the first two, this individual had a mark, a faint tattoo visible on the left wrist. It was a symbol, 3 stars arranged in a triangle. No one on site recognized it, but it would later become a point of investigation with intelligence databases. 3 freezers, 3 human bodies, preserved, nameless, devoid of identity or context, no accompanying files, no refrigeration logs, no biological storage permits, nothing to explain who they were, why they were here, or what purpose they served. The officers backed away. The scene was secure, but the questions were just beginning to erupt. How had these machines arrived on the property without attracting attention? The estate had tight delivery monitoring and private security. Who had helped install them? Why weren't they declared in insurance policies or property disclosures? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, what was Meghan Markle's connection to them? At that moment, no one dared speculate. The facts alone were explosive. The forensics team began the process of removal, slowly, methodically. The freezers were unplugged but kept sealed and transferred into a mobile containment vehicle parked discreetly behind the estate. Temperature control was critical. They had to ensure the bodies remained preserved for proper autopsy and DNA analysis. Each unit was lifted by custom hydraulic rigs and moved under tarp covers. From the outside, it looked like any other estate cleanup. Inside, history was being written. After the units were removed, the rest of the garage was scoured. Investigators noted the presence of additional items that raised more eyebrows. On a nearby shelf was a small binder labeled only with a single letter, L. Inside, laminated pages listed numerical codes, timestamps, and what appeared to be temperature calibration data. The numbers were meticulously recorded, some marked in red ink with underlines and notes in the margins. There was also a locked drawer beneath the shelf. A warrant extension was requested on-site and granted within hours. When opened, the drawer revealed several photographs, most faded, some printed on glossy paper, none labeled. Each photo depicted a child. Different children. One of them bore a striking resemblance to a toddler-aged version of Prince Archie. Another looked eerily like early images of Lilibet, though with subtle differences in facial symmetry. Could they have been prototypes? Doubles? Reborn models? Were these children real or fabricated? The implications were impossible to ignore. The final item retrieved from the garage that day was a sealed silver laptop with no manufacturer branding. It was password protected and encrypted beyond commercial standards. Authorities would eventually hand it over to cyber specialists for decryption. What lay inside, messages, images, financial records, remained unknown at that point. But its placement, hidden beneath the central unit's backup power supply, suggested it had value. As the last personnel exited the garage, a hush fell over the team. Not one of relief, but of realization. They had uncovered something historic, not just in scope, but in symbolism. A secret kept in the shadows of royalty and celebrity. A truth so strange, it defied all conventional understanding. Word of the operation hadn't yet reached the media. The estate remained under soft lockdown. Meghan and Harry had not yet issued a statement. But something had shifted. The locked door was open. The silence was broken. And the world would soon be forced to confront what had been kept on ice. Because in that sterile, frozen room, where luxury met secrecy, 3 lives had been reduced to silence. And someone had wanted it that way. That someone, many suspected, wasn't far from the truth. In fact, she might have been standing just outside the spotlight, smiling for the cameras, while a darker story unfolded in the shadows. This wasn't about a garage anymore. It was about something far colder, far more calculated than anyone could have imagined. And it had only just begun. There are moments in any investigation when facts become unbearable not because they're unclear, but because they're too precise. It's the moment when mystery transforms into horror, and the question shifts from what happened to why would anyone do this. That shift came swiftly after the forensic analysis began on the 3 preserved bodies recovered from Meghan Markle's garage. Each freezer had been transported with the utmost care to a private forensic lab in Los Angeles operating under tight secrecy. No markings were placed on the transportation trucks. No notifications were sent to nearby hospitals. The teams involved were instructed to use encrypted communication only. And at the center of it all were the 3 sealed bodies, now referred to internally as Subjects A, B, and C. Subject A, the first figure removed from the upright freezer unit, was processed first. The body was carefully thawed using a controlled low-humidity environment over the course of 36 hours. Medical examiners noted with astonishment that the preservation was nearly flawless. There was no sign of frostbite or tissue degradation. The skin was intact, the eyes undamaged, and the muscle structure preserved well enough for full biometric analysis. Upon unwrapping the polymer casing, the team found the subject to be a Caucasian male, estimated age between 25 and 30. He was of average height and build, with no visible scars, tattoos, or surgical history. His fingerprints were scanned into the national database. No matches. Dental records were analyzed. Again, no matches. There was nothing, no identity, no known history, no connection to any reported missing persons case. It was as though he had never officially existed. But it wasn't just the anonymity that raised red flags. It was the physical condition of the body. The subject's internal organs were pristine. His brain, heart, and lungs showed no sign of trauma or disease. Toxicology tests came back clean. There were no bruises, lacerations, or needle marks. The cause of death? Undetermined. There was simply no obvious reason this man should have been dead, let alone preserved in a custom freezer in the garage of a former royal. Then came Subject B. This body was markedly different. Slightly smaller, with more delicate features, and exhibiting signs that initially led examiners to speculate the subject was a female between the ages of 18 and 25. Upon closer inspection, however, the biology presented a puzzle. Certain physical traits didn't align cleanly with a single gender identity. The pelvic structure, larynx, and chromosomal testing revealed anomalies that raised more questions than answers. A possible intersex individual, a rare condition. Still, as with the first subject, no trauma, no disease, and no digital record of identity. The polymer casing on Subject B had been wrapped more tightly, almost as if the person had been restrained during the sealing process. This discovery prompted a deeper analysis of potential asphyxiation or chemical sedation, but results were inconclusive. No foreign substances were found in the bloodstream. The body had simply stopped functioning, but when and how remained unknown. The mystery deepened with Subject C. This was the body that had been found partially reclined in the 3rd freezer, eyes half open, with the triangle star tattoo visible on the wrist. The lab team immediately isolated the symbol and ran it through several criminal and military databases. The design matched no known gang affiliation, but a close variant appeared in files relating to experimental psychological research from the early 2000s, specifically involving mind state preservation and synthetic memory testing. That program had been quietly shut down and its findings sealed under national security guidelines. How or why this individual bore a similar marking was beyond explanation. Subject C was biologically female, with features suggesting South American ancestry, possibly Argentinian or Chilean. She was older than the others, estimated at 35 to 40 years. Unlike the other two, she had a small surgical scar near her left rib, consistent with a gallbladder removal. This one medical anomaly was the only potential lead in identifying her. But, once again, nothing matched. No hospital records. No identity. No family. By now, the forensic team had assembled a profile that stunned even their most seasoned pathologists. 3 individuals, biologically intact, undocumented, and all preserved with a technology that far surpassed standard cryogenic methods. Even more unnerving was what investigators discovered next, subtle signs that the preservation process had begun immediately after death, suggesting that the freezers themselves were not just storage devices, but death chambers. Autonomic responses in muscle fibers and organ rigidity hinted at flash preservation protocols. These freezers had likely been rigged to begin biological suspension at the moment of sealing. That meant these people weren't simply placed in the units after death. They may have died inside them. One technician, who requested anonymity, described the discovery as the most morally disturbing thing I've seen in 25 years. Another said, these weren't just bodies. They were assets. Someone took care to keep them as perfect as possible, like they weren't meant to decay, only to be returned. The phrase "to be returned" caught the attention of federal analysts monitoring the case. What if these bodies weren't evidence of crime in the traditional sense, but part of a larger scheme? A plan involving identity replacement, data erasure, and experimentation. Theories that once sounded outrageous now seemed chillingly plausible. When agents revisited the photographic evidence found in Meghan's garage, the images of children resembling her own, the investigation shifted again. Forensic facial analysis software was run against those photos and current public images of Archie and Lilibet. The results weren't conclusive, but one algorithm flagged a 94% match between the toddler in one garage photo and the earliest known public image of Archie. Another photo matched Lilibet's features with 89% probability, despite being labeled in the binder as Model 3, 2019 prototype. This revelation opened the floodgates of speculation. Could these preserved bodies have been surrogates or prototypes used for some form of gestational experimentation? Were they connected to the long-rumored surrogacy theories surrounding Meghan's pregnancies, rumors long dismissed as conspiracy, but now reborn under the weight of forensic data? Several medical ethicists were consulted behind closed doors. One, who had previously worked with private fertility clinics in Europe, described the situation as terrifyingly similar to early-stage biomodeling projects where fetal development was outsourced to anonymous donors or carriers, then concealed through media control and sealed medical files. It wasn't long before the investigation reached international dimensions. Interpol was alerted to possible trafficking implications. Officials from Argentina, Spain, and Canada were quietly asked to provide lists of missing persons fitting the general description of the 3 subjects. Meanwhile, digital forensics teams began decrypting the laptop found in the garage. It would take weeks, but early indicators showed the presence of encrypted folders labeled with vague identifiers like hold_1 and SUBGen. Even in the absence of unlocked data, one truth was now impossible to deny. These people had been hidden, deliberately, methodically, and without any concern for their identities or rights. What startled the investigators most was the intentionality. The effort it would take to acquire 3 undocumented individuals, subject them to precision preservation, build custom storage systems, and then bury them in a luxury home garage wasn't the act of a rogue scientist or accidental death cover-up. This had planning, budgeting, execution, and the person who had access to the space, resources, and influence to keep it hidden, that person was Meghan Markle. By the time this chapter of the investigation closed, public awareness was still lagging. Rumors had begun to leak, yes, but the full horror of what had been found and what it meant remained under tight control. Authorities were torn between containment and revelation. On one hand, the world had a right to know. On the other, the consequences of disclosure, global backlash, political firestorms, reputational fallout were unthinkable. There was still no formal statement from Meghan. No press conference. No denial. She had, reportedly, left Montecito quietly through a back exit 2 days after the raid. Her current location was unknown, and her legal team had filed no motions. Silence, in this case, had become its own type of communication. Behind closed doors, however, that silence was being replaced with urgency. The task force wanted answers. The public, soon enough, would demand them. And as the evidence began to stack in cold, irrefutable rows, one conclusion crept closer to the surface. The garage didn't contain leftovers of some forgotten past. It wasn't a storage facility for the bizarre. It was an archive, a vault of preserved secrets. And those secrets were no longer frozen. They were awake, and they were speaking. The term fallout is often reserved for post-war consequences or environmental catastrophes. But in this case, it applied with chilling accuracy to what unfolded after the forensic examination of the 3 unidentified bodies found in Meghan Markle's garage. Behind closed doors, the lab teams had confirmed what law enforcement feared from the start. This was not just a matter of hidden remains. This was a web of questions that, once touched, began to unravel the boundaries between science, ethics, legality, and royal secrecy. The forensic data began pouring in less than a week after the initial preservation reversal was complete. Autopsy protocols were executed with a level of care usually reserved for heads of state. The refrigeration units had maintained the tissue integrity so well that coroners were able to conduct cellular-level scans and extract full genomic sequences. But what they found buried in those genes was the beginning of a storm. Subject A's DNA profile was clean, intact, and stable. Yet when run through the FBI's combined DNA index system, CODIS, it returned nothing. Not a single match to any missing persons case, criminal profile, or genealogical database. Subject B, already flagged for biological anomalies, also returned no results, despite extensive chromosomal analysis. Subject C was even more perplexing. Not only did her DNA fail to match any national or international record, but her genome contained a series of engineered markers, sequences typically found only in lab-bred test subjects. That single detail, genetic engineering, shifted the entire investigation. These were not just lost people. They were, possibly, created ones. The forensic team issued an immediate internal escalation. Experts in bioethics, synthetic biology, and international law were brought in for a closed-session review of the genome data. Among them was a renowned researcher from the University of California, Los Angeles, who had previously served on an advisory panel for experimental gene therapy trials in Europe. Upon reviewing the sequencing patterns, he made a quiet but harrowing statement. These subjects have been modified, subtly but undeniably. This isn't just DNA. It's curated DNA. According to the preliminary genetic report, all 3 subjects exhibited enhancements in areas related to immune response, muscular repair, and cognitive retention. It appeared that someone, somewhere, had been running trials in human optimization, and the results were sitting in freezers inside a royal residence. Federal agencies scrambled. This was no longer about Meghan Markle's potential misconduct. It was about the possible existence of an illegal human experimentation program that had flown under every regulatory radar. Quiet inquiries were made to international biolabs, private genetic research groups, and university research departments known for their work in human cellular regeneration. No one admitted knowledge of such subjects. No program surfaced. But a few former researchers, speaking off the record, confirmed rumors of black ops science, private clients funding rogue labs to bypass ethical review boards and national regulations. Now the theory had evolved. What if Meghan wasn't just hiding these people? What if she was one of the clients? The investigation expanded once again. This time, the lens turned toward her financial history, specifically to the charity work and private consulting contracts linked to Archewell, her joint foundation with Prince Harry. A hidden transaction log, unearthed from one of Archewell's satellite accounts, revealed a recurring payment made to a biotech firm operating out of Uruguay, under a shell company tied to offshore accounts in Switzerland. The purpose of those payments was unclear. The descriptions were vague, categorized under consulting, infrastructure, and logistics. But when one payment, marked subject storage accommodations, appeared in a 2021 report, the task force grew still. It was enough to warrant subpoenas, enough to flag international watchdogs, enough to whisper that Meghan Markle, far from being an idle duchess, might have been financing or sheltering the results of a hidden biomedical program that now sat at the epicenter of a potential international scandal. The fallout deepened when a former Archwell logistics manager came forward. They had worked closely with Meghan for over a year, coordinating the shipment of materials between the U.S. and Latin America. During their tenure, they were asked to sign a confidentiality contract specifically tied to one item: freezer-grade specimen containers. When they inquired about the contents, they were told it was for archival preservation of private medical donations. But the shipping records didn't list organs, blood samples, or lab animals. They listed anonymous items labeled Prototype A, Prototype B, and Test Subject. The manager claimed they were dismissed shortly after raising questions. With this testimony, the narrative evolved from suspicion to substantiation. There were too many coincidences, too many signs that Meghan had been more than a passive bystander. The investigation's ripple effects began to reach Buckingham Palace. Behind palace walls, officials were reportedly stunned. Sources close to the royal household claimed that King Charles had been briefed in a private emergency meeting with MI5 and legal advisors. He was said to be visibly disturbed, pacing in silence as the details were laid out. While Meghan and Harry had long distanced themselves from royal duties, any crime linked to them would still reflect on the monarchy. To contain damage, palace attorneys allegedly contacted the Home Office and requested that no statements be issued without royal vetting. Internally, a plan was drafted to remove Archie and Lilibet from the line of succession pending the outcome of DNA verification tests. That action alone sent tremors through the royal family. The public still knew very little. Only whispers had escaped. Unmarked vehicles, sealed warrants, and whispers about biological material found in the Sussex home. But even as the press scrambled to confirm details, online conspiracy forums exploded. Theorists pointed to past inconsistencies in Meghan's pregnancies, her fluctuating belly size, the lack of hospital records, and the fact that no royal birth certificate for Lilibet had ever been officially released. Others dug up interviews, red carpet footage, and blurry photos of the Sussex children claiming subtle differences in height, skin tone, and facial structure across appearances. What had once been dismissed as fringe speculation was now recast under the cold spotlight of forensic reality. Meanwhile, Prince Harry was reportedly in emotional freefall. According to sources close to him, he had been blindsided by the discovery. While always protective of Meghan, he had allegedly grown distant in recent months. Rumors of private arguments, missed appearances, and quiet retreats into isolation. One source described seeing him pacing in a Los Angeles hotel lobby, phone in hand, muttering, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." It raised another heartbreaking possibility. Was Prince Harry, once the most beloved royal rebel, merely a pawn in a game far bigger than he imagined? And if he was unaware of the true purpose of the freezers, the preserved bodies, and the biotech payments, then who was orchestrating it? Meghan had not returned to Montecito. Her whereabouts were still unknown. Her legal team, contacted multiple times, issued only a one-sentence response. The Duchess will respond to any inquiry at the appropriate time through appropriate legal channels. No denials, no defense, just silence. Within forensic circles, the conversation turned philosophical. What had they really uncovered? Were these subjects experiments, victims, ghosts of a deeper agenda, or were they warnings? Proof of what happens when influence, wealth, and scientific ambition intersect without regulation? The truth was still distant, but the fallout was here, measured in subpoenas, DNA sequences, political panic, and the quiet, sobering realization that something had been hidden in plain sight for years. Behind one of the most famous faces on earth, behind a garage door, behind a smile. And now, finally, behind forensic fact. The term doppelganger, once reserved for folklore and literature, has become a curious fixture in modern conspiracy lore. It refers to the eerie notion that somewhere in the world, there exists a near-identical double of yourself. In most cases, it's pure coincidence. a stranger on the street, a celebrity look-alike. But when three perfectly preserved, unidentified bodies, each sharing uncanny resemblance to real public figures or their close associates, are discovered in a former royal's garage, the doppelganger theory moves from internet fringe into forensic reality. As the forensic investigation continued, analysts began to notice troubling patterns, not just in the physical details of the three bodies, but in how those details intersected with existing public records, photos, and behaviors surrounding Meghan Markle and her children. Subject A, the male, was of medium build, symmetrical facial structure, and had distinct cheekbone placement eerily similar to Prince Harry's. Not identical, but close enough that, when aged through AI facial projection tools, he bore more than a passing resemblance to early adult photos of Harry, especially from the time before he grew his beard. Investigators initially dismissed this as coincidence. But when Subject B's facial markers showed an 88% similarity to a composite image of an older version of Lilibet, they began to reconsider. Subject B had soft-boned features, delicate jawline symmetry, and a rare eye ridge angle most commonly found in a very small percentage of Northern European and South American genetic blends. This detail was particularly significant because speculation about Lilibet's heritage had long fueled online debate, especially after a controversial side-by-side comparison in a British tabloid showed inconsistencies between different appearances of the child. The images found in Meghan's garage, the photo binder marked only with the letter L, were now re-examined in forensic labs, not just for authenticity, but for origin. It was during this process that one technician stumbled across a detail no one had expected. Embedded in the metadata of one digital print was a tag from a now-defunct facial modeling software, used primarily in early 3D prototyping for animatronic human models. The software had not been commercially available since 2015. If these images were from a modeling program, not real photographs, what did that say about the children depicted? The more analysts dug, the more the uncanny emerged. Photographs of Archie released to the press in 2019 bore inconsistencies when compared to later images. His left earlobe appeared detached in some photos, attached in others. Eye color varied slightly. Even height progression didn't match normal growth curves. Was this just the result of bad lighting, camera angles, or altered photos? Or was there something far more deliberate behind the inconsistencies? The theory taking shape was as audacious as it was terrifying. What if Meghan had used subjects, biological doubles, to stand in for real people? What if the public had been shown one version of Archie and Lilibet, while other versions were prepared, stored, or presented when needed? The doppelganger theory suggests a strategic rotation, subtle switches using individuals so closely resembling each other that only forensic examination could tell them apart. A facial recognition team was brought in, using thousands of image points from Meghan's public appearances, her children, and those stored in the binder found in the garage. Their conclusion: at least 4 different sets of facial markers appeared across what was supposed to be one child, Lilibet. What's more, Subject C, the South American woman with the triangle tattoo, was found to have a nasal bone structure and lip ratio that matched images of Meghan's own mother, Doria Ragland, from her younger years. The match wasn't perfect, but within statistical range to raise questions. Could Subject C have been used as a maternal surrogate or visual stand-in for misleading the public? It seemed far-fetched, until a former security team member from Meghan's UK residence anonymously submitted a sworn affidavit claiming that during several scheduled public events, they were instructed to escort a woman who resembled Meghan from behind, never facing the cameras, while the real Meghan remained inside. The staffer assumed this was simply for protection, but with the new findings, the event gained sinister undertones. The doppelganger theory found fuel in Meghan's known media manipulation tactics. She had long been accused of tightly controlling press access, banning certain photo agencies, and even allegedly altering images before release. But no one imagined it could go this far. Could the children themselves have never been photographed in an unfiltered setting? Could some appearances have been completely fabricated using lookalikes or digital models? One viral theory even posited that Archie had no verified public voice recording. All available clips of him speaking were either off-camera or so heavily filtered they could not be matched to a real-time child voice. Was it possible that the public had been fed a fiction from the start? That Archie and Lilibet's identities had been created, curated, and occasionally swapped with doubles, models, or stand-ins? While social media ran wild with side-by-side comparisons, the investigation team focused on physical evidence. The freezers that once held the preserved bodies were scanned for biometric residue. Fingerprints, partial DNA, even traces of synthetic skin adhesive were found, substances often used in prosthetic applications. A matching adhesive was later located in Meghan's bathroom drawer during a separate search, labeled as film use only. When news of this surfaced internally, MI6 reportedly reopened an old file once discarded as paranoid. The file alleged that Meghan Markle had, during her initial courtship with Prince Harry, worked with a former PR consultant in Los Angeles known for staging illusionist-style events for celebrities. This consultant specialized in photo manipulation, fake pap setups, and using doubles to trick photographers. The file included screenshots from early 2016 showing Meghan on 2 different continents within 12 hours, wearing the same outfit. At the time, it was brushed off. Now, it was reclassified as credible. From an intelligence standpoint, the idea that Meghan had used body doubles, child stand-ins, or preserved prototypes raised deeply disturbing questions. What was the purpose? Was it to conceal the use of surrogacy? To evade scrutiny over the children's real biological origins? To deceive the monarchy? Or to manipulate public image for deeper psychological or financial reasons? These questions were no longer the musings of bored internet sleuths. They were now being asked in government offices, forensic labs, and royal strategy meetings. The doppelganger theory gained even more ground when a whistleblower from a private neonatal clinic in Buenos Aires stepped forward. The woman, who claimed to have once worked in embryo screening and IVF support, described a high-profile American client who had arranged for a surrogate contract involving twin gestations and anonymous donor eggs. According to her, the client never met the surrogate directly and requested all records be stored under pseudonyms. Payment was made in cryptocurrency. The timeline she described matched up almost exactly with Meghan's rumored disappearance from public life between late 2018 and early 2019, right before Archie's birth. Interpol was immediately dispatched to validate her claims, and although patient names had been scrubbed, security footage from the clinic dated January 3, 2019, showed a woman entering under heavy disguise. She wore a scarf, sunglasses, and a large hat, but motion-match scans performed by U.S. investigators later suggested a 76% chance the woman was Meghan herself. If true, it would confirm that not only had Meghan used reproductive services abroad under false identities, but she had possibly commissioned the preservation or creation of biological prototypes to support a fabricated royal lineage. Even if the theory was only partially accurate, it meant that the public and the royal family had been fed a curated narrative for years, one maintained not just through secrecy, but possibly through human manipulation and scientific deceit. The implications rippled beyond Meghan's reputation. The monarchy's own legitimacy was now under scrutiny. If the children weren't biologically tied to Harry and Meghan, or if they were mere representations used to fill a public role, what did that say about the line of succession, the role of the press, and the moral framework of an institution built on bloodline and tradition? In private circles, questions became unavoidable. Were the children ever legally registered? Were passports issued under false premises? Had medical institutions been coerced or bribed to falsify records? More troubling still was a quietly growing suspicion among investigators that the real children, if they existed, may not have been the ones seen in public. That perhaps the true Archie and Lilibet had been concealed entirely, and that the world had only ever interacted with the facsimiles, hand-picked lookalikes trained and presented for public consumption. Was this the performance of a lifetime, or a crime woven in plain sight? The doppelganger theory refused to fade. It had already become the investigation's most haunting element, because if it was true, then the garage in Montecito wasn't just a tomb. It was a stage. And the audience? All of us. To the world, Meghan Markle was a modern fairy tale. Hollywood starlet turned royal duchess, a woman who redefined palace tradition and challenged monarchy from within. But behind the carefully curated public image lay a trail of secrets, subtle, scattered, and often dismissed as coincidence or the product of relentless tabloid speculation.